Welcome back to The Explainer. So, if you've ever stared at a news headline screaming about economic growth or, a looming recession and wondered, wait, what exactly are they even measuring? Well, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're diving into the absolute core metric of macroeconomics, gross domestic product, or GDP. We're going to take this massive, insanely complex global economy and break it down into crystal clear, totally digestible pieces. Let's decode the numbers and completely change how we look at the world's wealth.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the global growth explosion, move on to defining gross domestic product, tackle the bread problem, look at 3 ways to calculate GDP, and finally, wrap up with nominal versus real GDP.
All right, part 1, the global growth explosion. Now, before we get into the actual math of how we measure the economy, we really have to look at the grand scheme of human history. Just take a look at the dramatic shape of this graph. Spanning 1,000 years, this is what economists call a classic hockey stick curve. Basically, global wealth, measured as GDP per capita, practically flatlined for centuries. For hundreds of years, the standard of living barely budged from one generation to the next. But then, bam. Right around the Industrial Revolution, the line just explodes upward. Places like Britain, Japan, and Italy suddenly skyrocket in wealth. It's literally an explosion of human output.
But, as you might guess, this incredible global growth isn't exactly uniform. Historical data from South Africa shows us the booms, the busts, the peaks, and even the dips below zero over the decades. Now compare that to a modern economic race, mapping South Africa's growth against the absolute powerhouse that is China. That purple line? Yeah, it's operating on an entirely different level.
So, looking at these historical spikes and modern economic races brings up a pretty fundamental question. When we hear that China is growing, or that the world exploded in wealth, what are we actually counting? How exactly do we measure this massive explosion of wealth with any kind of real mathematical accuracy?
Which brings us to Section 2, defining gross domestic product.
To answer that question, we have to look at the gold standard of economic measurement. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is defined as the total value of all final goods and services produced within the boundaries of a country in a particular period, which usually is 1 year. And listen, every single word here is a crucial part of the formula. This isn't just some loose theoretical concept, it's a very strict set of rules.
Let's actually break that definition down into its 5 core elements. First, it has to be expressed in monetary value. We can't just add 10 apples and 3 cars, right? We have to convert them into money to add them up. Second, we only look at final goods and services, meaning stuff that's ready for its ultimate use by a consumer. Third, geographic boundaries strictly apply. It absolutely has to be produced inside the country's borders. Fourth, it only counts current production, so only brand new goods and services made in this specific period. Reselling your used car? Doesn't count. And fifth, it's gross, which just means we don't make any provision for the depreciation or the wear and tear of our equipment.
All right, let's look at Section 3, the bread problem and avoiding double counting.
So let's shrink the vast global economy down to a micro-level analogy to see how this actually works in practice, because this is where people usually get tripped up. We can trace the life cycle of one of the simplest things in the world, a loaf of bread. It starts with a farmer harvesting wheat. Then, that wheat goes to a miller who grinds it into flour. Next, the baker buys the flour and bakes the bread. And finally, a delivery truck takes it to the shop where it sits on the shelf, waiting for you to buy it.
Now let's attach some real numbers from our source data to this exact journey. Step 1, the farmer produces wheat and sells it to the miller for 10,000 rands. Step 2, the miller processes it, turns it into flour, and sells it to the baker for 12,500 rands. Step 3, the baker bakes the bread and sells it to the shop for 18,000 rands. And Step 4, the shop sells the bread to the final consumer for 21,000 rands. Now, if we were to just add up the total value of all 4 of those individual transactions, we'd get a massive number, 61,500 rands.
So, here is the multi-million-dollar macroeconomic question. Is 61,500 rands the true value of production that we should add to our GDP? Well, the answer is a resounding no. If we use that number, we're falling into a fatal flaw of economics, double counting. Think about it. The price of the baker's bread already includes the price of the miller's flour, which already includes the price of the farmer's wheat. If we just add up all those sales, we are literally counting that exact same batch of wheat 4 separate times. Crazy, right?
To fix this double counting issue, we have to only calculate the brand new value created at each stage. So the farmer creates 10,000 in value.
The miller buys it for $10,000 and sells it for $12,500, meaning their newly added value is really only 2,500 rands. The baker adds 5,500, and the shopkeeper adds 3,000. When we sum up just that newly added value, we get exactly 21,000 rands.
21,000 rands. I really want to anchor this number in your mind. Did you notice how the total value added by every single participant perfectly matches the final consumer price of the bread at the shop? This is exactly why our GDP definition specifically states we only measure final goods and services. It's honestly a brilliant built-in mechanism to entirely sidestep the whole double counting trap.
Moving right along to Section 4, 3 ways to calculate GDP.
Now that we know what we're actually trying to count, there are basically 3 primary doors you can walk through to calculate GDP. And theoretically, they all lead to the exact same room. First is the production method, where we add up all the value added at each stage, just like we did with our bread table. Second is the expenditure method, where we simply look at what the final consumer actually spent at the till. And third is the income method, where we add up all the primary incomes earned by the factors of production, so things like wages, rent, interest, and profits. Whether you measure the value created, the money spent, or the income earned, you should mathematically arrive at the exact same final number. In our bread example, all 3 methods equal exactly 21,000.
But hey, this is economics, right? There's always a slight complication, and in this case, it's the government's invisible hand. Depending on which of the 3 methods we use, the numbers might slightly mismatch because of taxes and subsidies. If we calculate GDP based on the income of workers, we start at what's called factor cost. But to get to basic prices, we have to add taxes on production and subtract subsidies. Then, to finally reach market prices, which is the actual amount you and I pay at the store for final goods, we have to add taxes on the products themselves and subtract subsidies on those products. So economists are constantly having to adjust the math between these 3 price levels just to keep everything balanced.
Finally, Section 5, nominal versus real GDP. Let's zoom back out to the macro level to address a massive illusion: inflation. You see, when a country reports its GDP, there are 2 ways to present it. Nominal GDP is the raw measurement using current prices, meaning the actual prices paid in that specific period. But real GDP is an adjusted measurement using constant prices. Real GDP is absolutely crucial because it strips out the illusion of inflation. It allows us to compare actual physical production from one year to the next without the data being completely skewed by rising prices.
Let's look at a quick example of how this trap works with car production. So let's say in 2006, the country produced 1,000 cars priced at $120,000 each, making the nominal GDP $120 million. Pretty straightforward. In 2007, production goes up to 1,200 cars, but the price jumps to $132,000. Because of that price jump, nominal GDP skyrockets to $158.4 million. A huge chunk of that growth is literally just inflation. The true physical production only grew from 1,000 cars to 1,200 cars.
To solve this inflation illusion, economists use what they call a base year. Basically, they lock in the prices from one specific year, let's say 2010, and they use those constant 2010 prices to value the goods produced in every single other year. It completely anchors reality. As a rule of thumb, before the base year, nominal GDP is going to be less than real GDP because historical prices were lower. But after the base year, nominal GDP will be greater than real GDP, simply because inflation has pushed current prices up.
Which brings us perfectly to the golden rule of economic inflation adjustment. In the base year itself, nominal GDP will always exactly equal real GDP. Period. This is because the current prices of the base year are mathematically identical to the constant prices we're using as our anchor. It's the one perfect moment where the illusion and reality completely align.
Well, we've covered incredible ground today, from tracking global hockey stick growth to solving the double-counting bread problem, all the way to unmasking inflation. So I want to leave you with this final thought. The next time you see a news headline bragging about massive, record-breaking economic growth, I want you to ask yourself, are we truly producing more value as a society, or are we just staring at the mirage of rising prices? Keep questioning the numbers, keep looking for the real value added, and I will catch you in the next explainer.